Good evening, participants. Welcome back to lecture number 14 of this 15-day lecture series on history of English literature. Today, the deliberation will be on the postmodernist period, the various features, characteristics, important texts that play a significant role in that particular phase of history of English literature. And we have among us Dr. Minu Suzanne Koshy. Some of you all might be aware of her because she is a very integral part of our fraternity. And we are so happy to have her back. And on behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, I would like to take the honor and opportunity to introduce a very short introduction of Dr. Minu, who is presently working as an assistant professor in the Department of English, Marthama College for Women in Ernakulam, Kerala. She has published extensively in national and international journals and has served as a resource person at conferences. Her areas of interest include cultural studies, post-colonial studies, and comparative and world literatures. She is a reviewer for the Journal of Global South Studies and a member of the editorial board of Education, Society, and Human Studies. Her books include Narrating Childhood Trauma, The Quest for Catharsis, which was published in 2015, a translation of the Malayalam anthology Tattoo, which was published by Authors Press by Jacob Abraham, an edited collection of poems by Elizabeth Curacos titled Gossamer Reveries, and Mapping the Post-Colonial Domestic in the works of Vergis Leos and Mukundan, Tales of the Threshold, which was published by Cambridge Scholar Publishing in 2020. An edited volume titled When Objects Write Back, Reconceptualizing Material Culture in the Tricontinent is scheduled to be published by CSP later this year. On behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, it's an honor and pleasure once again to welcome you. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation and speaking to this heterogeneous group of audience, which always is a very challenging task. Without wasting much time, the platform is all yours, Dr. Minu.
Thank you, Dr. Saikat. So we collaborate once again on a project, and I'm really happy. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about the postmodernist period. As you see, the lecture is titled The Arrival of the Postmodernist Period, Texts, Tricks, and Trends. Now, this is how the presentation is structured. First, I'll give an overview of the age, and then we'll discuss how the postmodern age, what was the background and what were the influences that led to the arrival of the postmodern age. And then we need to think about what exactly is postmodernism and what are the tenets and the concepts central to it. You might know that the moment you hear postmodernism, terms like difference, deconstruction, trace, all these come to your mind. So we'll discuss all these in section 4. Then we'll go on to discuss the postmodern thinkers and works. I've taken only 3 or 4 major thinkers. And then after that, we'll discuss postmodern literature in short. I mentioned a couple of texts and some writers and some movements. So I've given some lists also. So to maintain the to make the presentation very precise, I have included only a few names and few texts. Now, towards in section 7, we will deal with the end of the postmodern age, and not that it's a question mark. Okay, we need to interrogate whether it is actually the end. And in section 8, we see novel tendencies that are arising in the place of the postmodernism. And finally, we will conclude. Now, postmodernism, as most of you know, is a socio-cultural, literal, and artistic movement. It was not just confined to literature. It was also visible in the social sphere. It was also visible in architecture. It was visible in painting. And it began in the late 1950s. It reached its peak during the 1960s. And later, towards the 1990s, it slowly started declining. The name postmodernism indicates the period after modernism. So in many ways, it is a continuation of and rejection. At the same time, it is a rejection of modernism in the sense that it embraces the rupture. Modernism entailed a rupture with previously existing concepts such as realism, bourgeois realism. Postmodernism continues with this trend. At the same time, it is also a rejection of some ideas of modernism, such as the division between high and low art, and several other such concepts. Now, you must note that postmodernism emerged after the Second World War, and as such, it's reflected the anxieties and fragmentation that characterized the world after the Second World War. The First World War itself left the world very disillusioned, and after the Second World War, already it is very chaotic, as modernism indicates. If you might have listened to lectures on modernism itself looks at how the human psyche got ruptured, got fragmented, and how it got depiction in literature and art. Now, the Second World War led to a further disruption and a general disillusionment with the world, and a rejection of everything that was considered quote unquote true till that point. So postmodernism is a marked rupture or divergence from all that went before. The term postmodern was first used by John Watkins Chapman when he was discussing a painting. So till then, French Impressionist painting, a part of the modernist movement, was very prominent. And when a new style of painting arose, in order to distinguish it from this French Impressionist style, Chapman termed it a postmodern style of painting. This is how the word was used first to indicate a different style of painting. Now, in Bernard Bell, in Postmodernism, in his major work, he talked about a period after modernism. He talked about postmodernism as the obvious period after modernism. So that he just used it as a label in the sense, in the historical sense, in the chronological sense, to indicate the time period. Now we come to when and how it was used in the sense of a historical movement. It was first used by Arnold Toynbee, who says that our own postmodern age has been inaugurated by the General War of 1914 to 18. So he says that it began even much before the 1950s. The First World War itself was an indicator of the emergence of something new, of the postmodern period. Now afterwards, Peter Drucker termed it a nameless era. Whatever happened between 1937 and 1957, that was not modernism. So Peter Drucker termed it a nameless era. Okay, and by this he implied postmodernism. The term was used in the current theoretical sense by Franco Aliotard, as most of you might know, in his work, The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge. We will discuss Lyotard's contributions in detail at a later stage. Now, how did postmodernism arrive? The origins of postmodernism can be located in Kant, Hegel, and Nietzsche. Kant talked about the Copernican revolution, where he said that we cannot know a thing in itself. You see a mouse before you, you cannot understand it unless it is represented through language. Okay, it is all about representation. In order to understand something, you cannot see something and comprehend it or internalize its meaning. For that, you need it to be represented, maybe through language, maybe through painting, maybe through gestures, but representation is essential in order to comprehend something. Okay, now Hegel also talked about a similar idea when he said that the relationship between a subject and an object, it is always mediated. So if I have a relationship with an idea, it is probably through my sight, it is probably through my reading. Okay, so whatever relationship exists between a subject and an object, it is always mediated. Okay, so he didn't specifically say through language, but when we look at it from the lens of postmodernism and later developments, we can see that language plays a crucial role in mediating between the reality and the concept, or the existing entity and the sign. Now, Nietzsche also talked about how the distinction between the real and the illusory world vanishes. Okay, so this is similar to Baudrillard's idea of the simulacrum. He says that he talks about how something is imitated, and gradually this imitation, the hyper-real, becomes more real than the real. Nietzsche already talked about it when he talked about the distinction between the real world and the illusory world, and how this distinction is broken down. Okay. So the origins thus can be located in the early philosophers. Now, as I mentioned before, the postmodern period emerged after the Second World War in the 1950s, and it flourished during the 1960s. And by the end of the 1990s, technically it was coming to a close, although people disagree even today. Now, at that time, the time of its emergence was one fraught with unrest. Okay, there was Algerian War of Independence against France. There was unrest in USA and France, and then there was a Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. So all these movements, all these political situations influenced the minds of the people, the minds of the artists, who began writing about things that concern their inner psyche. They realize that a unified narrative is not always possible. They realize that science cannot explain everything. They realize that science is not a remedy for problems. They realize that science cannot bring in peace. Okay, so all existing belief systems were broken down, and as such, a new movement emerged, a new tendency emerged in literature. Besides, there were other developments. The world was progressing very fast. Sputnik was sent in 1957, and the age of space exploration set in, and man landed on moon for the first time at around this period. So, as you know, new wave science fiction is a part of the postmodernist movement. So all these, the landing of Sputnik, the landing of man on moon, the space exploration, and more research on these areas helped in the production of science fiction during this period. Now, a central moment in postmodernism as a theory was a publication of grammatology in 1967 by Jacques Derrida. So Derrida's concept of deconstruction is perhaps the central concept in postmodernism. Okay, this is what is highlighted. There are a number of other concepts as well, but Derrida is in a way considered a very central figure in postmodernism, in that he gave rise to a new way of reading a text. Deconstruction is a method of reading a text. Okay, we'll discuss this in detail at a later stage. Now, again, as I mentioned before, Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge, published in 1979, was yet another major contribution to postmodernism as a theory. Now, postmodernism talked about, it has been defined or described as a phase characterized by a lack of belief about or in meta-narratives. What are meta-narratives? Meta-narratives, again, we'll discuss in detail, but still, yeah, meta-narratives are totalizing systems of thought, okay? Totalizing systems that make you believe in certain truths. For example, sometimes we are told that human emancipation is a process that happens and that has happened throughout the centuries, okay? So human emancipation is a central point in history, in sociology, in science. Okay, so human emancipation, either in terms of the social structure, the financial situation, or it maybe you talk about a war and you talk about how it leads to emancipation of a certain country. Okay, so everything gets centered around this idea of emancipation. Another meta-narrative would be, say, science. Okay, during the Enlightenment period, science assumed a lot of prominence, and everything was explained through science. Science was considered as the central, as the core of any given social phenomena. Everything revolved around this idea of science. Even before that, if you look at medieval Europe, God or religion was the center. Okay, the religion or God in itself was a meta-narrative, in that everything pointed to, everything centered around, revolved around this central concept. Okay, now postmodernism said these are all functions of ideology and these are all hierarchies. Okay, now religion is again a construct. Religion is a construct. Science cannot explain everything. So postmodernism rejected these kinds of meta-narratives. these are also called grand narratives, narratives around which most of the phenomena was explained. Like to explain birth, people used science during the, God during the medieval period, science during the later period. So everything came to be centered around these narratives. Okay, now postmodernism subverts this idea and says that these cannot be considered the center. Now, postmodernism, as I mentioned before, is applicable in art, philosophy, literature, architecture, and it is also a reaction to the assumed certainty of scientific or objective efforts to explain reality. So, man or woman, human beings are in a constant attempt to explain reality. Why does this happen? Why is there a typhoon? Why is there a cyclone? Or why is the world like this? What is it? Why is the shape of the moon like this? So people are constantly out to explore reality. So postmodernism said science or objective facts or truths are not enough to explain the world. Okay, you need something more. Now, the postmodernists also rejected this notion of truth. Truth is, again, they said that there is nothing called truth or essence or fact. What is your truth is my lie. Okay, I give you a test and all of you fail. My truth is that none of you study. Your truth is that the exam was very tough. Okay, my truth is true for me, yours is true for you. But so as such, there is no objective, absolute truth or essence. And the postmodernists also talk about this concept of identity. Okay, a person's identity is constructed. It is not a given. You're not born with your identity. It's not inherent in you. It is rather constructed by social forces. Okay, so there were a number of such concepts that postmodernism believed in. Okay, now it was of course influenced by structuralism and post-structuralism, deconstruction. All these are related concepts. Okay, so after structuralism came post-structuralism. Generally, postmodernism is mentioned in association with post-structuralism and sometimes synonymously with post-structuralism. Now, and related to postmodernism, there are several concepts that we will discuss in detail. Now, these are the major themes or tenets of postmodernism. The major one is skepticism. As I mentioned before, people lost their belief in already existing systems. People lost their belief in science or religion or ideas that were central to their existence before. Okay, they believed that science could bring in progress and peace, but that did not happen. Okay, just like in the case of modernism, here also people were disappointed with the promises made by science, religion, and all such institutions. Okay, so as such, the literature is characterized by skepticism. Okay, that's a doubt. People are doubtful about everything. They're not sure about the results. They're not sure about what is happening. They're not sure about anything. There's a kind of absolute shakenness in their being. Now, it is also characterized by parody and pastiche. Okay, parody is when you take something and you imitate something and you make fun of it. Pastiche is when you take something, when you mix some things together and then you are celebrating it. Okay, so literature shows features of both parody and pastiche during this period. Now, another central feature associated with postmodernism is the self-referentiality of language. Okay, that is, language does not need an external referent. In structuralism, it says that there is a signifier, a word, and outside there is a signified. The signifier becomes important only because there's a signified outside. But postmodernism says, no, that's not necessary. You don't need to see or feel the object outside. Okay, language is self-contained. Meaning is generated through difference between various words in the language. For example, if I say house, the associated terms are mansion, hovel, hotel, palace, bungalow, whatever. So house assumes its meaning from its difference from these 5 associated words. A house is not a mansion, house is not a palace, a house is not a bungalow. So all these exist in the same axis. All these are places to dwell in. But the house's meaning arises from its difference from the other words. Okay, so the words, the difference from other signifiers are enough to create meaning. Postmodernism is also characterized by a certain kind of pluralism and eclecticism. Eclecticism is when multiple things, multiple disciplines maybe are mixed together. A number of ideas come in when you look at postmodern literature. For example, okay, let's take the instance of the academia. In many ways, people say that English teachers of English or academicians in the field of literature, English literature, they do everything but literature. They talk about sociology, they talk about anthropology, they work on religion, and rarely about literature. Okay, so now there's an emphasis on multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. This itself is a consequence of postmodernism, where you're mixing multiple things, because one entity is often not enough to explain everything. Okay. Now, maybe someone's identity, for instance, it is not a given. You're not born with your identity. And your identity is not created just by your class. It is also a result of your class. It's a result of your gender. It's a result of your personal experiences. So anything can be, nothing can be defined through a single set of criteria. Okay, you need multiple axes within which you can define a certain subject. Now, it also says that our belief systems, our values, they are all dependent on the social circumstances we are in. For instance, robbery is considered very bad. Stealing is considered very bad in today's world. Okay, a thief is often punished. Okay, the thief is considered a so-called bad person. But in Greece, this was considered an art. There were even thieving competitions in Greece. So in Greece, in the previous, not now, but earlier, it was considered an art. It was considered a skill. A man who could steal was considered a very smart and efficient kind of person. But today, it is frowned upon. So values themselves change from place to place and time to time. Okay, postmodernism highlighted this idea. So when someone says you should not steal, this is an idea given by maybe Christianity, or the centralizing or totalizing narrative given by Christianity. But there are alternate belief systems. There are alternate ways of looking at it. And these ways are constructed by the social order in which they are set. So postmodernism accepted this idea. They said that everything is constructed. No, you're not given something. You're not born with values. Values are not given by some power up there, but rather the society constructs these kinds of values. Okay. Now, in this context, I would just like to say something about the matriarchal, the kind of matriarchal system that existed in certain parts of India. Like, in Kerala, for instance, there was the Marimakatayam system, okay, where a woman could choose her partners and she could have multiple partners. But in the West, which is dominated by Christianity, polygamy was not allowed. It was not considered pure. It was considered evil. So when they came here and they encountered, they came with their Enlightenment rationality. When the British came here with their Enlightenment rationality and saw this, they could not accept it. But this system of matriarchy or Marimakatayam was totally accepted in Kerala. There was nothing wrong with it. There was no issue of values or ethics centered around this phenomenon. But then the British brought in a change because they were unable to accept it. This is just the instance of one place in the world. Okay, if you look at the African tribes, if you look at the Indian tribes, whenever there was an onslaught from the West, the Westerners came with their Enlightenment rationality. There were a lot of ruptures that happened in these places in terms of their systems. Okay, so in that way, postmodernism also looked at how colonialism led to breakages or fragmentation in other communities. Because till then, the Enlightenment rationality was considered something special. Okay, but with the advent of postmodernism, people started looking at things and saying that, see, there are local interpretations to things. Not everything needs to come from somewhere up above. Okay, so there are local truths. The truth is not one absolute given. There are local truths, there are local values. Okay, and no one, the West or the Europe does not have any right to encroach upon these areas and bring in new belief systems. Okay, so postmodernism in that way led to a wider embracing of other cultures and the diminishing of the prominence given to the West. Now, then postmodernism also led to a dissolution of the distinction between high and low art. Till then, high art, there was this distinction between the art that was pure, okay, something that involved a lot of techniques, methods, something that would appeal to a certain class. And then there was a low art, which was associated with perhaps the lower classes, or perhaps it did not have so-called literary value. Okay, the art which people said, oh no, it does. Sometimes even today we can hear that, right? When we talk about novels by so-called pulp fiction writers, we say, no, that is not standard literature. You cannot include that in literature. Okay, so some literature, so some works are considered low art, while some are considered high. For instance, jazz music was considered low art, while opera, all those were considered high art. So in postmodernism, this hierarchy began to vanish. Everything began to be accepted as art, and no distinction existed between, or ideally there was no distinction between high art and low art. Okay, this explains why say Chetan Bhagat's books were included in the Delhi University syllabus. Okay, till then, or not till then, even now there are people who consider it as not good enough, it is not literary enough. Okay, but then postmodernism embraces all kinds of literature. All literature is literature. Okay, there's no distinction between high art and low art. And it also talked about subjectivity in art. That is, whatever you write, it is dependent on you. Your truths, your way of looking at the world. These are all unique. No one can impose these things on you. There is no truth that is given to you. There's no truth that is given to you. Everything is constructed. Your identity, your essence, the way you look at things, everything is constructed by the social values, and this will be reflected in the art you create. Postmodernism was also informed by a denial of Enlightenment ideas. This we discussed before, but whatever happened during the Enlightenment, like the idea of truth. There's a truth, there is something called truth given by God, or maybe a religion. Okay, this idea was dismantled by postmodernism. Again, the idea of an objective reality. Reality is a single given. This idea was also debunked. Now, the meta-narrative of science, or the belief that science would bring in human progress, was again dismantled, because see, look at the Second World War. The Second World War happened even precisely because science was developing. Okay, so people were doubtful about whatever they believed in till now. Now, Enlightenment also emphasized on reason and logic. They said that you have to be rational. Now, what is this rationality? What is logic? These are also contested questions. So the emphasis given to rationality also began declining during this period. The Enlightenment humanism, for instance, talked about human nature. Human nature is like this, or human beings are prone to behave in certain ways. Postmodernism said that is not the case. There's nothing called a human nature. Everything that you have, your nature, so-called nature, your identity, all this is created by certain social systems, by certain value systems, by your culture. It is not given to you. There's nothing absolute called human nature common to all human beings. Now, it also dismantled this notion that language represents an outside reality. Postmodern literature, if you look at it, plays with words, plays with language. Sometimes there are nonsense words also, but they also indicate something. There is no reality out there to understand a word like krom, krom, krom. There is nothing outside, okay, to make you realize that, to make you link krom, krom, krom with something, but still it exists. Still it is a real thing in literature, okay? So you don't need an outside reality for language to exist. Okay, then the concept of binary oppositions is central to enlightenment, to the enlightened, like good, bad, or good and evil, Christian, pagan, dark and black and white, man and woman. Okay, so in all these cases, an opposition, two poles were created. One stood in opposition to the other. Good stood in opposition to evil. Now these 2 points were necessary for any axis to exist. Okay. Now this is what Enlightenment believed. So there was no notion of a hierarchy. I mean, there was no conscious notion of a hierarchy there. So good existed, bad existed. The opposite of good is bad. Man, often the opposite is woman. Okay, so Derrida and other post-structuralist thinkers said that these are actually hierarchies. Okay, often the second term is the first term is privileged over the second. Okay, for instance, when you say good and evil, good is good, evil is bad. Man and woman, man is superior, woman is inferior. Black and black, white is superior, black is inferior. So without telling you, a hierarchy is being created there. So postmodernism oppose these kinds of hierarchies inherent in binary oppositions. Then, as mentioned before, the stability of meaning came under question. They said that there is no single meaning. You cannot take a word and say that this is the only meaning of this word. Any word has multiple meanings. You cannot take an event and say this is its signification. Any event can have multiple significations. The same with human nature, truth, morality, value systems. All these are socially contingent. They depend on the social circumstances. Now, it rejected philosophical foundationalism. Now, during the Enlightenment, before postmodernism, even during modernism, people were trying to find a foundation on the basis of which theories could be developed. Okay, they wanted something stable on which they could create things. For instance, they wanted science to be a central point. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So everyone wanted a certainty, a certain foundation on which they could build ideas and theories. And postmodernism rejected such an idea of a foundation. Postmodernism said this foundation itself is shaky. What you call foundation, like maybe it could be science or maybe God, these are not absolute existing entities. These are themselves questionable. Maybe religion, even religion itself comes under question. So it cannot be a foundation. Okay. Now, they also said that you cannot always construct theories to explain phenomena. The moment you construct a theory, you are generalizing something. So you construct the theory of evolution. You are saying that everything evolved through this Darwinian process. Okay. The moment you create a theory of looking at language, you say that this is how all languages function. The moment you create a theory about monogamy, you start believing that this is how everything functions or should function. Okay. So you give, like, if I take the example that I gave before, you take the example of marriage. Okay. If the theory is that an ideal marriage should take place between one man and one woman, okay, then you think that this is the reality, this is the truth. All other methods or means or all other systems are aberrances. Okay, so Derrida and other post-structuralists said that this is not true. You cannot construct theories and generalize everything. You cannot use one theory to explain a lot of things happening at different periods of time in different places. Now we'll move on to the next slide. Yeah. As I mentioned before, the grand narratives and meta-narratives came under interrogation. Okay. Derrida and the others said that, Lyotard, Baudrillard. They said that these meta-narratives, till now, they dictated how the world ran. Okay, till now, Europe believed that God was the center or science was the center, and this is how everything was explained. Okay, or maybe these meta-narratives could be anything other than God and science and progress of human beings. It could also be Marxism, feminism, or science as an emancipatory force. A meta-narrative is anything that is considered the center around which everything else revolves. Okay? So postmodernism brought these things into question. And there was an emphasis on local and multiple narratives. They gave postmodernists accepted the fact that there is a world outside you. They accepted the fact that there are local narratives, not just grandiose, all-encompassing narratives like science or God or religion. They looked at multiple local narratives. And the postmodernist texts reveal one central feature of postmodernism, fragmentation. Okay, the thoughts of a person, the thoughts of the character are fragmented. The story itself is fragmented. Maybe there's a character and you're writing a story about him from multiple viewpoints, and you are not told. There's this text called Mrityunjaya in India. So in Mrityunjaya, it's a story of Karna. The first chapter is from the viewpoint of Kundi, the second chapter from the viewpoint of Karna, third from that of Duryodhana, and so on. Okay, in postmodernist text, you are not told who is speaking. We don't know who is speaking. So there's an absolute chaos. There's absolute incoherence and confusion. Now, the world is considered a simulacrum. Simulacrum is a term associated with Lyotard. He talked about simulation and simulacrum. Now, these are explained in detail, but just for you to understand, I will just give a one-sentence explanation. Simulation is a process of imitating a world or a system. And simulacrum is the copy, is the imitation. For instance, Lyotard talks about Disneyland. Disneyland was created as a mini model of America. But gradually, Disneyland became America. People began associating America with Disneyland. The real America started vanishing or changing, but Disneyland became the ultimate, the America. Okay, so this is how it becomes a simulacrum. It becomes so much of a copy that the real ceases to exist. The real gradually vanishes. Okay. Now, so again, another point that we discussed earlier, identity is considered a construct. Then there's a concept of difference that is again related to deconstruction. We'll come to it soon. And absurdity and existentialism. You might be familiar with the existentialist movement. I think we have a lecture series next to next week where we have this session on existentialism as well. So obviously the lack of an absolute truth or center indicates the lack of meaning in life. Okay, so existentialism talks about how life becomes meaningless. Life is not becomes, it is meaningless. There's no purpose to your life. There's no purpose to what you are doing. The entire human condition is absurd. There's something strange about the human condition. So existentialism also arose as a result of, as a part of the postmodern disbelief in meaning and the center. Now, now we'll move on to the major postmodern thinkers. Lyotard. Okay. He was the first, as we mentioned before, to use the term postmodern in the current theoretical sense. He was a French philosopher and sociologist. In his text, The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge, that is a subtitle, a report on knowledge. He says that the postmodern indicates an incredulity towards meta-narratives. Whatever was considered the center, they are no longer the centers. These meta-narratives are not believable. These meta-narratives are not the ultimate truths. This is what postmodernism advocated. Now, they considered postmodernism a part of, Lyotard considered it a part of modernism, and he also talked about the abundance of micro-narratives. Like we mentioned that, there are local narratives, there are multiple narratives. Okay, now instead of the meta narrative or grand narrative, Postmodernism welcomes micro-narratives. Okay? And he explains this idea using Wittgenstein's idea of language games. A language game, Wittgenstein talks about a language game. There you're playing a game using a fixed set of rules. Okay? You have when you play a game, a language game, there are rules that are centered on language. For instance, if you're playing, this is a very basic rudimentary example. This is not given by Wittgenstein. For instance, if you are playing a game where you're giving clues, okay? So I have an object in my mind and I'm giving clues for the other person to guess what it is. So suppose the object is a sofa, okay? So I would say it is long, it is, you can sleep on it, you can sit on it, but I will never mention the exact word sofa ever in my clues. The moment I mention it, the game is over. So this is a rule centered on language. Okay, so Lyotard borrowed from this idea, and he says that the micro-narratives are also centered on language, on the use of language. Not centered on, involves the use of language. Now, the grand narratives were replaced with micro-narratives or little narratives. Now, the absolute truth, the idea of absolute truth and totalizing theories were rejected. He also said that you cannot use a theory to explain every phenomena in the world. Okay? Now, he focused on power, on the power of technology to transform knowledge. Okay, he wrote extensively on the technology and its interference in the real world, but he talked about it in a positive sense. He was in favor of technology. His major works include Discourse, Figure, published in 1971, Libidinal Economy, and the central text, The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge, published in 1979. If you're preparing for NET or maybe PhD entrance exams, you might find this useful because the subtitle, you should focus on the subtitle, The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge. Now, the different phrases in dispute and lessons on the analytic of the sublime. Then, so Lyotard talked about these kinds of, basically all of them talked about similar things, just that, there are certain concepts that are central to each of them. For example, if you're asked who is associated with the term postmodern condition, it is Lyotard and not Derrida. Someone who is associated with the term deconstruction, it is obviously Derrida and not someone else. Okay, so you should be very clear about the terms that are used by each of these theories. Now, Derrida was an Algerian-born French philosopher, and his central contribution to postmodernism is deconstruction. Deconstruction, which is a method of reading a text. He mentioned it in his work of grammatology. His other works include Speech and Phenomena, Writing and Difference, Margins of Philosophy, of Spirit, Spectres of Marx. But for us, the most important text now is of grammatology. Now, Derrida talked about a number of concepts, including logocentrism or the metaphysics of presence. Logo means knowledge. Centrism means placing knowledge at the center. So logocentrism is ultimately a desire it's a desire to express, to place a concept or an absolute truth at the center to explain all phenomena. Okay, so if you give excessive importance to religion, it is enough to explain how you were born, how the world was born, how this happened, that happened, or if you believe in science, you can get explanations based on science. Okay, so logocentrism talks about how some ideas are privileged and all theories are constructed around this privileged idea. Now this becomes the core. This knowledge, this idea of human progress or science or religion becomes the core, and everything becomes centered around it. It becomes the ultimate reference point. Okay, and it is used in the term metaphysics of presence is also used interchangeably with logocentrism. Derrida talks about the metaphysics of presence, which is a privileging of presence by Western philosophy. Presence in the sense of something being there. Something being there. We can discuss this by taking the idea of speech and writing into consideration. When you're speaking, the listener is present in front of you. But why do you write? You write for someone who is not present before you. You write for someone who is far away, who might take your work and read it. But when you speak, the listener is present. Okay, so speech is presence, writing is absence. And as such, the social order privileged speech over writing. Writing was considered secondary, speech was considered primary. Okay, so whatever was present was considered significant. Okay, now the metaphysics of presence talks about this, how whatever is present before you is considered more important than something which is far away. Okay, now postmodernism debunked this notion as well. They said that you need not privilege your presence. There is no need to privilege a presence. Presence in itself is not a criterion of merit. Now, so logocentrism is used interchangeably with metaphysics of presence. Now, Derrida also talked about the transcendental signified. It is a signified which transcends all signifiers. No signifier is enough, it goes beyond all signifiers. Generally in language there's a signifier and there's a signifier. If I say watch, there is a watch. The WATCH is a signifier and the object is the signifier. But the transcendental signified, it is beyond all signifiers. All meaning making points to this transcendental signifier. An example is God. God is considered as the above all signifiers. Now, whatever meaning making you engage in, the ultimate reference point is God. There is a God out there. Okay, so this is the idea of the transcendental signifier, something that is beyond all signifiers. All signifying processes or all meaning making processes point to this transcendental signifier. Now, Derrida talked about arche writing, which is the original language. It is an imaginary kind of language. He says that it is not derived from speech. We always say speech comes from, writing comes from speech. So as I said, speech is always privileged. So first you speak and then you write. Whatever is spoken is written. Okay, so speaking comes at the top, writing comes below speaking. Okay, but Derrida says that there's something called arche writing, which is not derived from speech, which is not secondary, which already exists in the human mind, even without the presence of speech. Okay, now you understand. Now, if you read a little more in detail, you will understand how arche writing dismantles the notion of metaphysics of presence, dismantles the privilege of presence, because Derrida is saying that yes, speech indicates presence, but there is also writing which is not derived from speech. There's also writing which is primary. So that is it about arche writing. Now, trace. Trace is the absent part of the sign's presence. Okay, so whenever there is a sign, for instance, if I say, I'll take the example that I gave before. When I say I went to a house, it means I walked and went to a building, which is a house. The moment I say house, I'm saying I did not go to a palace, I did not go to a bungalow, I did not go to a hotel, I went to a house. So the moment I say house, there are the other meanings following it. There are the other words following it. Okay. So when you talk about a sign, you should understand that there are associated meanings, that it leaves behind. Okay. A house is a house because it is not a hotel. A house is a house because it is not a mansion. But the moment you say house, these things also come to your mind. The idea of a building, the idea of a hotel, the idea of a mansion, a palace, it comes to your mind. Okay, so these are traces. These are traces of the sign. So there is a sign, I show you SC, and you imagine the house, the building of the house, but there are the meanings that we neglect also. These are the traces. These traces gradually vanish. They are self-effacing. Okay, so they exist, but you do not see them. They gradually vanish from the picture. Now, Derrida talk about the supplement. Supplement means, in general terms, you talk about protein, vitamin supplement. Okay, you take vitamin supplement just as an additional thing. You don't really need it, but you're just taking it for additional support. Vitamin supplement. That is a general meaning. But Derrida says that why would you take a supplement unless you need it? You may say that it is inessential, but you're taking it because it is essential in some way or the other. Plus, you can add something to, if there's a glass of water, you can add more water only if the glass is not fully filled. You can add something only when there is a gap, right? You can add some more water only if there is space. Same thing. A meaning can be added only if there is a gap. For instance, if you say white and black, or maybe east and west. Oh, okay, suppose you say black and white. Now, the white is considered superior and black is considered something inferior. So the moment we say white and black, the black exists to support the white. Okay, the black exists because it is filling something that is absent in the white. In any binary, there is a lack in the first, and the second exists to support or to supplement this lack. You cannot just add something. You cannot say day unless there is night. You cannot say white unless there is black. You cannot say man unless there is woman. So the second entity comes to fill a gap in the first. Think about this in slightly abstract terms. So Derrida's point is a supplement is not something that is inessential. You can add something. You can add a meaning or a word only if there is space for it. Okay. So if you then you say good and bad, the bad exists to supplement the good. The good exists because the bad exists. You can talk about the good only if you differentiate it from the bad. So these are mutually related. Now comes a central concept, difference. It is read difference, although it is spelled D-I-F-F-E-R-A-N-C. It is a play on the French word defere, D-E-F-E-R-E, which means two things. The French word for D-E-F-E-R-E means two things. One is differ, in the sense of differ from something. There's a change from something. Black and white differ from each other. That is, there's a difference between the two. The second meaning of the term differ in French is to defer, D-E-F-E-R. That is to postpone. So difference is a combination of postponing and difference. Difference and deferment. Okay. So in language there is difference. That is, it's read difference. Okay. So in language there is difference. That is, the words differ from each other and meaning is always postponed. So these are the two things that happen in language. Okay. So one sign differs from another sign. For example, a cat is a cat because it is different from a rat, because it is different from a dog, because it is different from a zebra. Okay. So a cat, cat becomes a cat because of its difference from other signs. D-I-F-F-E-R-E-N-C, difference from other signs. Now there is also deferment or postponement. So suppose you need to say, I went to the house. Okay. The house indicates that there are several other things following. Okay. So the moment, or I went to a building. Okay. Suppose I say I went to a building. So the building has traces of, has multiple meanings. The building could be a hotel or a flat or a villa or a mansion, palace, whatever. So to specify, like when you're reading, I went to a building, you would want to know whether I went to a house or a mansion or a palace. So there is always a postponement of meaning. You cannot get an absolute meaning at one go. This can be understood better if you look at the process of referring to a dictionary. Suppose you hear the word X. just any random word, and you check the dictionary. Okay, so you check the dictionary and you see many synonyms for this word. First, there's a meaning, and then you see some synonyms. Then you don't understand the meaning of the synonym. Why? The nuances of the meaning. Then you check why, and then you see some more synonyms. Then you go to another page of the dictionary and check those. So meaning, an absolute meaning is not possible. It keeps on being postponed. Okay, so difference explains how meaning is created. Meaning is created through difference and deferment. Difference between sides and the deferment of multiple meanings. Now we come to the central idea given by Derrida. Deconstruction. It's a post-structuralist theory which questions and dismantles binaries. This again we mentioned before. It says that a hierarchy or a binary like man-woman, black-white is never innocent. Postmodernism, deconstruction says it is never innocent. It is implied, it is imbued with multiple meanings and hierarchies. The moment you enter a binary, there is a hierarchy involved in it. So deconstruction dismantles these binaries. Now, when you deconstruction is fundamentally a way of reading a text. Now, if you take a text, deconstruction involves uncovering the tensions and contradictions in the text. That is, Derrida says that a text deconstructs itself. Maybe a text is written for a particular purpose, but the very sentences in it, the very signs that are used, the very words that are used, sometimes end up subverting the intended meaning of the text. I'll give a very basic rudimentary example for you to understand, okay, this concept. Now suppose there is a text about women empowerment. You are reading an essay on women empowerment. So the surface level idea that you get is about women being emancipated, the need for women to be emancipated, or how women, what should be done for emancipation. So the central idea is women's emancipation. Now suppose someone says, suppose there's a sentence, a person should look after his well-being. A person should look after his well-being. There's a problem there. The moment you say his, you are privileging the male over the female. To be politically correct, you have to say her or his. A person has to look after her or his well-being or one's well-being. But the moment the his comes, the idea of the text is subverted. The idea of women's emancipation, the idea of equality is subverted the moment you mention this one word in the text. This is a very basic example, okay, to look at how a text deconstructs itself, a text dismantles itself. The text, the text says that, see, I am conveying this particular message, and you read it and you understand that, no, this is not the message it conveys. So there are some tensions or opposing ideas inherent in any text. Now, deconstruction looks at these points of instability, looks at points where the ideas in a text contradict each other. And deconstruction tells us that a text is not a logical unified whole. We want to believe that a text is a whole. Theorists before this kept on repeating that a text is a whole. A text should be a whole. If you look at the traditional military criticism, all writers, including Plato, Aristotle, to the modern thinkers, they emphasized on how the text should be a coherent, logical whole. Now, deconstruction says that a text can never be a logical, complete entity. There are tensions in the text. Meaning is continuously being postponed. You cannot find one meaning in a text. You cannot say that this is the exact meaning of this sentence, because meaning keeps on getting postponed. This idea receives symbolic representation in texts like If on a Winter's Night a Traveler by Italo Calvino. Now, Italo Calvino's this text, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, you can read it from the beginning, first to last or last to first, you will get the story. Okay, but the story that you get might be different. Okay, now there's possibility of multiple meanings. The interpretation is not just one, there's a possibility of multiple meanings. And why is there this possibility? Because meaning is constantly being postponed. Okay, meaning constantly gets postponed, and that is why You don't get an absolute one single logical whole text. The meaning keeps on being postponed, and as such, the text also keeps on undergoing minor changes. And deconstruction also dismantles, also reveals the tensions inherent in the text. Okay. Now, Hillis Miller says that the deconstruction shows that a text has already dismantled itself. You're trying to interpret a text, but the text has already not exactly disintegrated, but say dismantled itself. Like I talked about the feminist text, where the sentence itself deconstructs or dismantles the text. Now, any text is fundamentally undecidable. The meaning, there's no absolute meaning and keeps on being postponed. You cannot decide the meaning of a text because the words themselves have multiple meanings and these meanings are constantly being postponed. Now, deconstruction also looks at the hierarchies inherent in binaries like man, woman, upper caste, lower caste. So deconstruction attempts to dismantle these hierarchies. That is why a lot of movements, subaltern studies movements came up. Postmodernism emphasized on dismantling hierarchies. Postmodernism did not accept hierarchies. Postmodernism rejected this notion of the center and the periphery. Earlier, the center was the Western world and the East was the periphery. The Occident was the center, the Orient was the periphery. Okay, postmodernism and deconstruction opposed this idea. Now, subaltern movements, post-colonial movements were all influenced by this kind of questioning of existing hierarchies. The creation of a center and the relegation of the of other entities to the margins. So, emancipatory movements were deeply influenced by deconstruction. Now, John Baudrillard, this is the third theorist, one of the most important post-structuralist, postmodernist theorists. He's considered the high priest of postmodernism. Now, he talked about two central concepts, or maybe it's just actually one concept: the precision of simulacra. I already talked about simulacra. We'll look at it in a little detail. Now, he says simulation is no longer that of a territory of a referential being or a substance. It is a generation by models of a real without origin or reality, a hyperreal. It is no longer a question of imitation, nor duplication, nor even parody. It is a question of substituting the signs of the real for the real. He gives the example of psychosomatic illness, dyspnea, and whatever. To understand this, I'll repeat what I said about simulacra and simulation. Simulation is a process of imitating someone or making a copy. Simulacra is the copy. Okay. Now, Jean Baudrillard talks about a map of the empire. It talks about the map created by an imaginary empire. There is a map which is as big as the empire itself. This country has colonized a number of other places and they create a map. This map is as big as the empire, like in reality as big as the empire. Now the empire itself has disintegrated. The countries have become independent, but still the map exists. The empire looks at its map and thinks that this is the reality. The map is actually a copy of the reality out there, but gradually it becomes the reality for the empire. This map becomes the reality. Now, another instance would be, as I mentioned, Disneyland. Disneyland, it was created as a miniature America, of a representation of the American dream, of what America could be, a magical world of possibilities. Okay, but America turned out to be totally different from all these. But Disneyland became the object. It became the central point. So the copy became the real. The simulacra becomes the real. The precision of simulacra indicates how the simulacra becomes more real than the real. Like we see some things like cooking games and video games. We have cooking games on mobiles. Okay, people who don't know cooking, like me, they play video games and engage in cooking. So here is actually a copy or simulacra of what is happening in the real world. But for the person playing this game becomes more real than the real cooking happening outside. So the simulacra precedes the real. Okay. So it is a copy that substitutes the real. The real becomes insignificant, and the simulacra becomes prominent. Okay. Now there are 4 stages to this simulation. First, it reflects the reality. Okay, for example, the map that I mentioned before. First, it reflects the real empire. Then what happens? It changes this empire, as in the empire might have disintegrated, but the map continues to show all these territories, even the disintegrated territories. This becomes a belief system for the empire. Now, gradually, the territory vanishes completely, but still the map exists as a reality. Now, again, what happens? Finally, there is nothing, not even the idea of a territory. There's nothing of that sort. There's the idea itself of the empire or territory has vanished, but the map exists. Then the map becomes a pure simulacrum. The map becomes its own simulacrum. The territory has vanished. The real does not exist anymore. But the simulacrum or the copy becomes the real. Now, the hyperreal is again used interchangeably with the simulacrum, more real than the real, like amusement parks, video games, like I mentioned. Now, the games that we play online, okay, are examples of this simulacrum. Now, the major works by John Baudrillard, The System of Objects, Simulacra and Simulations. The Gulf War did not take place. It's a very interesting text. Okay, it looks at Baudrillard also talked about how media distorts the truth. Okay, now in this post-truth society, what is the truth for us? What the truth is often something that is mediated by the media. Truth is always something that is created by the media. There's a recent Malayalam movie called Janaganamana, which talks about, which mixes some real events that happened, like the JNU sedition case and the murder of a rapist by a Hyderabad police officer. So a lot of recent political events are mixed together, and it talks about how the media creates realities. Okay, so the same thing happened in the case of the Gulf War. Some media reports created this notion of the Gulf War. That is the argument. Okay, that is not the reality. The Gulf War or whatever events happen around us are mediated by the media. Finally, what really happened becomes insignificant. What the media projects before us, the simulacrum, becomes the reality for us. So this is a central argument that Baudrillard makes, that the real ceases to exist, it stops existing, but the copy or the simulacrum becomes the real for us. Now, another theorist is Frederick Jameson. He wrote Postmodernism on the cultural logic of late capitalism. He says that postmodernism has commodified the historical past. Postmodernism has led to the weakening of historicity. Historicity or chronological history is no longer significant. As such, capitalism becomes prominent. Okay, now he also talks about the distinction between high and low art, the lack of distinction between high and low art. He also says that technology brings in depthlessness and superficiality. He says that the current world where we use mobiles to surf, to browse, to take a glimpse into things, and it creates a certain kind of superficiality. You play video games, you play a cooking game, but you cannot cook outside. You are on Facebook and you have friends, but you do not have in the outside world. Okay, so it creates an alternate world. It creates, Facebook is itself a simulacrum. It is a mini representation, a virtual representation of the real world, but there is nothing real in it. Now, for us who spend a lot of time on Facebook, this becomes the real. The real world vanishes, and this simulacra becomes the reality for us. Simulacrum becomes the reality for us. Now, there are a number of other theorists, so we are running short of time, so I just mentioned the names. Rollo Barthes was actually initially a structuralist and then turned to post-structuralism. Foucault, Deleuze and Guattari, now Rorty, all these theorists. If you read up on these people, you understand how they contributed to postmodernism. But the three major thinkers are Derrida, Jean Baudrillard, and Lyotard. Now, postmodern literature. Now we come to postmodern literature. What are the tricks and trends that we see in postmodern literature? Obviously, fragmentation. The fragmentation that characterizes the postmodern world is visible in literature as well. That is, one paragraph might talk about the rain, the next paragraph might talk about food, or one paragraph might talk about their person's experience in the present, and suddenly the next paragraph might be a flashback into a long forgotten past. Okay, so you tend to get confused. Okay, so the narratives are often incoherent and fragmented. Now, self-reflexivity and metafiction. Okay, an excellent example is the story by Koshy about a park. There's a story where there's a man who is sitting in an armchair and reading a text. Or he's reading a novel, and in the novel there's a man and a woman, and they are planning to kill someone. And then there's a description of the man and woman talking. Then gradually we see this man running through a park and reaching a road where this reader is sitting and he's about to kill the reader. So here we don't know what is real and what is fiction. So there's a blurring of the boundaries between the real and the fiction. Okay, and there are texts which reflect on themselves. Okay, so postmodernism also blurs the boundaries between the real and the imaginary. Now, metafiction, I'll give another example. There is a story called Koshy and the Villawoman. There, a person is writing a novel. So he finished writing the novel, and he's about to go to sleep, and he sees a person outside the window. Okay, and this person says, "I want to enter this text," and this man says, "No, my novel is complete." And then this man says, "No, I am coming," and he jumps through the window and enters the text. This is an instance of metafiction, where the writer tells you, see, what you are reading is fiction. You are aware that what you are reading is fiction. There is a text itself tells you that, see, I am fiction. So this is also a trend that is seen in postmodern literature. And spatiality and temporality are distorted. Okay, there are frequent flashbacks. There's frequent foreshadowing. In the end, you get confused as to what is happening when. At the end, you are this Borges's work. Forget the name. This Borges's work about a spy. That is an instance of the labyrinth. The labyrinth is an instance of this distortion of spatiality and temporality. In this story, Labyrinth, he talks about the Garden of Walking Paths. He talks about how time is structured, how time gets broken or distorted and fragmented, how space gets distorted and fragmented. All these are instances of postmodern literature. Okay, so in the Garden of Walking Paths, the idea of time is very, very significant. So there's a constant movement between past and present. There's a constant reference to something that happened years back. Okay, there's a reference to the labyrinth of time. There's a reference to the concept of a parallel universe. Okay, so this is an interesting text in the sense that in the Garden of Walking Paths, there's a labyrinth. In the labyrinth, there are walking paths. The paths are going in different ways. Okay, now a number of possibility. Any possibility is possible in this text. For instance, generally when we read a story, the prince wants to marry the princess. Okay, so he has to fight a dragon. He goes and kills the dragon and marries the princess. Okay, so he has two possibilities. Either he goes, kills the dragon and marries the princess, or he gets killed by the dragon and he cannot marry the princess. In some texts, both these are possibilities. Both these things happen at the same time. In one chapter, the prince kills the dragon and marries the princess. In the very next chapter, the prince dies and he cannot marry the princess. In the third chapter, that prince again becomes a character. So you are completely confused. A dead person comes to life in the next chapter, as if it is totally normal. So this is an example of how postmodern literatures work. In this context, we must also mention the hypertext fiction or digital literature. So there's a story where there's a character called Mary. So Mary gets her vacation. She happily comes back from school and she's ready to enjoy the vacation. Then you're given two links. Go to Madrid, go for a computer course. So you can press either of these. Whichever you press, you will get another story. At the same, I mean, like if you press go to Madrid, then you will get two more options. Go to a bar, go for a salsa class. Okay, so you can create your own story. Every possible thing is given in that text. The hypertext contains all possibilities. She can go to Madrid, she can go to a dance club, she can go to a park. Okay, anything is possible. Multiple possibilities are available. Okay, so this is a direct derivation from postmodern literature, where there are parallel universes where multiple possibilities are open to the reader. Now, fabulation, the creation of fantasy worlds, imaginary stories, sometimes stories which are completely unbelievable. The postmodern angst, the feeling that life is meaningless, existentialism, all these become visible in postmodern literature. Now, multiple points of view. Instead of one person narrating, we have multiple narrators. And these narrators are unreliable. Sometimes the narrator says something which is not true. The narrator says something, but in the next chapter, you understand that what he said is not true. So there's an unreliability. You cannot say that this is the meaning of the text or this is the truth mentioned in the text. So this unreliability is perhaps the central feature of postmodern literature. Now, irony, paradox, all these feature constantly. Then postmodern literature, subaltern literature is also considered a derivation of postmodernism, in the sense that postmodernism dismantled this hierarchy of the center and the periphery. It's the same thing that is happening when if you take Dalit emancipatory movements, feminist movements, LGBTQ movements, all these, or the Black liberation movements. So a way of challenging hierarchies, the literature of the period challenged hierarchies. Postmodern literature also talk about subcultures, like youth subcultures, the story of teenagers, like in the case of The Catcher in the Rye. The story of people of drug cultures. You know, if you take the poems of the Beat generation, you can see that they talk excessively about drugs. So those kind of drug cultures, the other subcultures, teenage cultures, all these become evident in postmodern literature. I've given very few examples of postmodern literature. One among the first novels written in the postmodern style was The Recognitions by William Gaddis, published in 1955. It has very long dialogues and sentences begin with a dash. You know, you don't know why they put a dash, but these sentences begin with a dash, and we don't know who is speaking. We can only assume who is speaking, and suddenly a person called X in the next chapter he becomes Y. That we are not informed of the change of name of the character, so we tend to get absolutely confused. The overall effect is one of confusion and incoherence. Now, The Catcher in the Rye, a very popular work by Salinger, alienation, depression, and as I mentioned, youth countercultures. Okay, here you see American English being used. Okay, so till before modernism, there was a reluctance to use anything except standard English. Okay, now postmodernism appreciated the use of colloquial language or slangs because it pointed to the existence of micro narratives and micro realities. Now the narrator is again in The Catcher in the Rye is unreliable. Okay, and Here Holden, the central character, is confined to a psychiatric ward. Okay, so postmodern literatures also have this preoccupation with mental trauma, psychosomatic illnesses and all that. So Holden's situation is ultimately the postmodern situation. He is in the psychiatric ward. He wants to talk to others, but he is not able to communicate the meaning properly. This is the postmodern condition. We are unable to communicate in a meaningful way because meaning is constantly being postponed. There is no absolute meaning, and as such, there's a possibility of miscommunication. So, Holden's situation is symbolic of the postmodern condition. Now, William S. Burroughs of the Beat generation is The Naked Lunch, which has a non-linear narrative and the plot is unclear. If you read it, at the end, if you ask what is the story, we won't be able to tell the exact story. There's no exact story there. Something happens. That is all we can say. Okay, so if you teach it to your students, for instance, at the end, after the class, they will probably go and discuss it and say, I don't know what was being discussed. I don't know what the text means. Okay, so there's no plot. There's no clear plot. The narratives are very disjointed and the grammar and syntax are also unconventional. Now, postmodernist writers often deliberately use wrong grammar, the wrong syntax, and it is a way of challenging the standard, challenging the center, saying that, see, there are alternate ways of expressing reality. Now, Slaughterhouse-Five, I want to give, that is metafiction, non-linear narrative, again, black humor, existentialism, all these feature in Slaughterhouse-Five. Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. It is, again, war also features as a theme in many postmodern works. Slaughterhouse-Five is an example. Catch-22 is another example. And they also use paradox. The narration is non-linear. Religion is challenged. Okay, so this is again another instance of postmodern fiction. Now, new wave science fiction also arose as a result of postmodernism. It emerged in the 1960s and 70s, right at the time postmodernism was flourishing. It occurred both in the US and the UK. And again, like in the novels, there's an emphasis on drug cultures, sexual liberation, things that were till now taboo were explored in postmodern narratives. New wave science fiction also used experimental language, like in the other postmodern texts, war, drugs, all these feature as major themes. A number of other novels. Gravity's Rainbow is very important. I didn't include it just to save some time, by Thomas Pynchon. Now, Gunter Grass's The Tin Drum and Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. Then Hopscotch by Julio Cortázar. Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire is again very, very significant. Then you have the recent texts like The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, The Sense of an Ending, Kafka on the Shore by Murakami. So these novels, all these are instances of postmodern texts. Now in poetry, we have various movements like spiralism, we have the Black Mountain poets, we have confessional poetry. There's a separate section. I mean, in the next lecture series, I think these things will be dealt with in detail. So I've included only a few, like the Black Mountain poets, including Duncan, Robert Creeley, Paul Carroll, Charles Olson. So if the Black Mountain poets wrote objective and concrete poetry. Okay, so the idea was one line should be uttered in one breath. One breath should be enough to utter one line. Okay, so the rhythms of natural breath were considered important, and their most important feature, that was the postmodern feature, was a given set of rules were rejected. They wrote about new things in new ways. Beat generation, we already mentioned Burroughs. So Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, all these come under this area. They talk about depression, they talk about anarchy, they talk about alienation. They subverted all existing norms of poetry. Like if you look at the poem Howl, okay, all existing rules pertaining to literature were broken. Then we have jazz poetry. Till Till the advent of modernism or postmodernism, it was considered substandard. Okay, jazz poetry in itself did not exist, but such ways of mixing low art and high art were considered substandard. Okay, but with postmodernism, the situation changed. Then we have the confessional poetry of Robert Lovell, Sylvia Plath, and Sexton. They talk about the two taboo issues. Postmodernism and postmodern works also gave license to writers to talk about issues such as mental issues, depression, trauma, sexuality. Till now, these were all hidden from the public view, but now poets had the freedom to write about uh, these taboo issues, and they could also write in different ways, flouting the usual rules of poetry. Postmodern theatre. The postmodern theatre, while postmodern fiction and postmodern poetry it's gradually receding, and new types of poetry, new types of fiction like hyperlink fiction, digital fiction are emerging. Postmodern theatre, at least in India, is still in the beginning stages. I mean, that's my personal opinion. There might be, you might know better about theatre, but if you look at the case of Indian theatre, the postmodernism is it's gradually making its presence felt in contemporary theatre. So in postmodern theatre, the audience is very much a part of the meaning-making process. The play does not exist without the audience. Also, the conventional division into acts and scenes does not exist. Okay, the moments in which these events unfold are significant, but there is no emphasis on act or scene or exact division of the plot into equal sections or something. There's nothing of that sort. And sometimes dramatists stage a play only once. They don't play it twice. They don't rehearse it and play it a second time somewhere. Each play is a unique experience. Each performance is presented in a unique way. Now, the written text itself has vanished. If you look at contemporary theatre, which is flourishing in places like Chennai, there is no text at all. There is no scripted text at all. Whatever is happening on the stage is often spontaneous. Okay, there's a concept of the meta theatre. The play is totally detached from reality, and the play becomes very self-centered. It focuses only on itself. Okay, even by taking the audience into account. Now, contemporary theatre. Suppose there's a play and it involves a woman cooking in the kitchen. There will be the smell of the food in the auditorium or in the theatre. Okay, so whatever is happening on the stage, you experience it. The audience's experience matters. Now, the postmodern theatre is gradually making its presence felt in India, but the Argentinian writer Griselda Gambaro, German writer Heiner Müller, the others, there are many people who are practicing it. But unlike fiction and poetry, these are not, the postmodern theatre has not got as established as fiction or poetry. It is still, in the beginning stages in India. Now, is there an end to the postmodern age, and has the postmodern age ended? Now, towards the new millennium in the 2000s, there was this opinion that the postmodern age has gone out of fashion. Linda Hatchian declared that it is over in her work, The Politics of Postmodernism. She says the entire movement is over because the impulses which led to the movement are vanishing. Some of the points, some of the reasons for the emergence of the postmodern age was the World War. Now, people who believe that it is over, they say that there are not many wars now. There's no reason to be totally disillusioned. There are alternate possibilities. Okay, so some people strongly believe that the postmodern age has come to a close. But what next? There is no answer to that. Okay, so the very people who say postmodernism is over, they are not willing, or they're not ready to give an explanation to what is happening now. Is it the postmodern age, or is it is it still the postmodern age, or have we moved on to a totally different scenario altogether? Now, different people give different substitutes. Some people talk about postmodernism. trans-postmodernism, digi-modernism, there's a repetition here, meta-modernism. But none of these have been accepted into mainstream parlance. The academia has not accepted any of these, okay, because basically all these things are old wine in new bottles, because they talk about fundamentally the same thing plus technology. Okay, for instance, digi-modernism is the same as postmodernism, just that some more technology is included in it. Okay, so these are some of the new terms that are being discussed in the context of postmodernism. Now, postmodernism was Tom Turner talked about it. He talked about it in the context of urban planning. Okay, he says that the old styles of planning have changed. Now there is more of an emphasis on geometric patterns. Postmodernism was against any kind of pattern. Postmodernism was against any kind of system. But Turner says that now there is a tendency towards geometric patterns and fixed structures. Okay, he talks about it in the context of urban planning, not in the general sense. And he says that the current era is one of postmodernism, where there's a fusion of faith and reason. Okay, faith and reason are not separate, but they combine, they merge together. Because in the Enlightenment period, focused, emphasized on reason. The medieval period focused on faith, but the postmodern period gives equal importance to both. Then Mikhail Epstein talked about trans-postmodernism and takes the example of the Russian writer Timur Kibirov. Postmodernism emphasized on irony. Trans-postmodernism is non-irony. Other than that, Epstein is not able to highlight anything significantly different from what we term postmodernism. Then there is postmillennialism, which is a term coined by Eric Gans in 2000. So it discusses this idea of victimary thinking. So in postmodernism, we have people, marginalized sections like women or lower classes, lower caste people, Jews, Holocaust victims, all of them talking about their victimhood. There's an emphasis on victimary thinking. And I have been the victim of something bad. Okay, but postmillennialism, in postmillennialism, there's a rejection of victimary thinking. That is, people do no longer talk about I am a victim, I have been oppressed, I have been harassed, but rather they try to engage in a non-victimary dialogue. Like whatever happened, happened. So let's engage in a dialogue and come up with something productive. The postmodern tendency to project oneself as a victim, the glamour associated with victimhood is decreasing. That is what postmillennialism says. But our contemporary fiction and poetry does not seem to agree with this, because there is still the literature of trauma, still there's a literature of suppression, marginalization, subalternity. So post-millennialism is probably more of an idea rather than an existing reality. Probably in the next 100 years, something like this will come up. Now, digi-modernism is associated with Alan Kirby, who wrote about it in his book, The Death of Postmodernism and Beyond. In digi-modernism, which is also called pseudo-modernism, it's just an excessive dependence on technology. And Alan Kirby says that this is a period of instant gratification. Okay, you want to have some chocolate, take the mobile, take Swiggy and order it. Okay, you want someone to appreciate you, just post a picture on Facebook and people will like it. Okay, so you're happy. Your happiness is instantly received. Okay, now you want to go to a party, but you are an introvert. Open a video game where there's a party, dress up and go. Okay, so whatever you want to do, you can do, but in a hyper real world or in an imaginary world. You are not participating in the culture at the real level. Rather, you are a superficial part, engaged in a superficial participation in culture. Everything is available on mobiles. Everything is available on the laptop, and there's an excessive dependence on technology. Even for personal happiness, you depend on likes and subscriptions on Facebook. So Alan Garby says that there's a silent autism that envelops the society. Okay, so people gradually become, they gradually tend to become shallow, and they tend to become very complacent because everything is available at the edge of at their fingertips. So there is no need to actually go out into the society or interact with people or be a part of the society. So Digimodernism takes a very negative view of contemporary systems. Now we have meta-modernism. Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin van Acker in their notes on meta-modernism, talked about this concept. Now, a meta-modern sensibility it is in certain socio-political instances. So, if you talk about climatic change in the climate, some people say yes, climate is changing. There is global warming. There is pollution. There is the ozone layer problem. Everything. But some people totally deny this existence of this entire thing called climatic change. They say that there's nothing called climatic change. There's nothing called a threat to the earth. There's nothing called a threat to the environment. Okay, so some people are totally naive. They deny the existence of something. While some people are so obsessed with this idea of climatic change that they border on the fanatic. Same thing with, say, religion. Some people they tend to maintain a distance between religion and themselves. Okay, so they term themselves agnostic, neither here nor there. Then there are the absolute fanatics who takes a radical stance. So Vermeulen and Acker say that these are all instances of a meta-modern sensibility, because there are various levels where first you are very ignorant of things, and then you take a stand, and then you reach the extreme stand. Okay. Now, how does it make it different from any general theory? I'm not aware of that. So Vermeulen and Acker do not elaborate on that either. This is I personally feel that this is a kind of arbitrary argument. Okay, whatever is happening around, normal things, even normal things happening around you club them together and give it a name, meta-modernism. I think that is what has happened here. I don't know how far this kind of a theory is reliable. Now, here the meta is taken from Plato's idea of the metaxy, where there's a movement between two poles and beyond these two poles. So Vermeulen and Acker say that this is meta-modernism is something located between modernism and postmodernism. It is neither modernism nor postmodernism, it is something in between, and it also goes beyond modernism and postmodernism. It doesn't actually make sense. It is modernism, which is postmodernism, it's also after postmodernism or beyond modernism and postmodernism. So sometimes these kinds of things look like theories made to create theories, but probably, as time progresses and there are more works on these kind of theories, maybe we will be able to understand them better. For now, very limited information is available on, say, something like post-millennialism and meta-modernism. Now, the question before us as we conclude this lecture is, can postmodernism end? We need to think deeply about this, because as I mentioned, postmodern theatre is just flourishing, it's just taking roots in India. So in such a situation, has postmodernism ended is a very contested question. Now, fiction. Even the recently released work like Whereabouts by Jhumpa Lahiri, this is postmodern. It was just released in 2021. So how can this movement end, or is there an end to a movement? And if we are moving on to a new age, what is this age? What do you call this age? Or are we still in the postmodern era? Because whatever is happening around us, there's not much of a difference between the literature of, say, the 1960s, 70s, 90s, and today. There is difference in the sense that there's more of technology. So a new age, if it comes, has to incorporate more of technology, like in the case of Digimodernism. Technology has become a central part of our literature. The film field is showing a marked change in the since OTT releases are possible. So the entire system of making a film, the entire techniques used, they are gradually changing. So digital literature has emerged from, as I said, from postmodernism. Uh, the digital literature has its roots in postmodernism. I talked about the hypertext, link fiction, where you can choose the story. So you click a link and there is a story. For instance, you go to there are sites. There are very few sites. Okay, mostly these digital literature comes from America, so there are very few writers. So you can choose a stormy night or a calm night. So if you press stormy night, there's a story. A calm night, there's another story. So there are more and more links, like in a labyrinth. So this also derives from postmodernism. This is very similar to the Garden of Walking Paths, the story Garden of Walking Paths. So has postmodernism come to a close? Will it ever come to a close? Is a very contested question. Now, unless there is something radical happening, there cannot be a, I feel that there cannot be a change. And that radical rupture can be in the form of technology, but even though technology is progressing very rapidly and there are changes in various fields, I don't know how far there's something radical about this change. How far postmodernism has been able to detach itself from the current literary and political scenario, especially in developing countries. So that is it. That is it about postmodernism. There are various aspects have been explored, and some have been left unexplored. So maybe for the next lecture series, where it will be discussed in detail. So thank you very much. I hope you like the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Minu. As usual, we thoroughly enjoyed your lecture. It was a very enriching and full of information and the concepts that you discussed. And the participants have thoroughly enjoyed your lecture. The testimony to the fact, you can see there are a lot of thank you and congratulatory messages in the chat box. Yes, there are a few concepts of postmodernism that you will discuss in the next lecture series, which we start from tomorrow. The details of the lecture series is being shared with the participants in the Telegram group, as well as you can see in the chat box today. So we will have many concepts of postmodernism in the next series, which I think there are more than 22 concepts. We are dealing with postmodernism for 4 days. Various concepts. So thank you on behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, although you are a very integral part of that team. Thank you so much. There are a few questions. One is by Bikas Kumar Nayak, and he says, what is historiography metafiction?
Could you repeat it, Dr. Saika?
Yeah, what is historiography metafiction?
Okay, so I'm not much aware of the details, but it's where historical fiction uses metafictional techniques. Like metafiction is basically when you are aware that a text is something, a work of fiction. So historiographic metafiction, it focuses on historical events, historical figures. It's basically historical fiction. It uses the techniques of metafiction, like self-reflexivity, or talking about itself. So that is what it is. I cannot talk in detail about that.
Right. There's this next question by Tathagata Chakravarti, and his question is, in your lecture, you have talked about hypertext, which shifts the authority over the text from the author to the reader, and a reader can choose what to get. So does it mean that a dictionary and a glossary is also a hypertext? And if so, then can we say that hypertext is not a product of postmodernism?
Yes, like in the case of hypertext fiction, the authority moves to the reader. We can decide what we want to read. But a dictionary and a glossary, how can they be hypertext? Again, it depends on how you view it. There is a limit, right? So dictionary and a glossary, you can check the meaning. You cannot choose the meaning. Okay, but yes, there might be some, like in the sense of some similarities, but I don't know how far you can consider dictionary and glossary as hypertext, because there are limited meanings available, and the possibilities are in a hypertext. For instance, there are say 2 possibilities, and you can choose the possibilities. In the dictionary, I don't know how far the reader has some kind of agency. You can open it and check whichever word you want, but that's at the superficial level. But when you think about hyperfiction, it is more about a series of choices, a series of possibilities which lead to other possibilities. In dictionary, you can say it is a deferment of meaning, but I don't know. I don't think it can be considered as equal to a hypertext fiction.
Right. Thank you. There is a question by Ognomitra Roy, and Ognomitra's question is that one of the common tropes concerning artificial intelligence in sci-fi is the fear of artificial intelligence taking over. Now, he has given the example of Professor Shonku. We can take a very common example of the Terminator movie series, right? Where a robot, tries to take the place of its creator. Now, there are many such stories. Now, how can we view this from a postmodern perspective, and can we apply the idea of simulacrum here? Yeah, the question I would repeat. I would repeat the question once again. Like there is always this fear of artificial intelligence taking over the creator. The product taking over the creator. For example, he has given the example of a series we have. It's by Professor Shanku. It's called the series, and there is a very common example which we all know, that is Terminator film. The movie series. Now, how can we view this from a postmodern perspective? Can we apply the idea of simulacrum here?
The artificial intelligence, the instance of this robot trying to replace its creator, is a Frankensteinian situation where the creator gets overshadowed. Now, yes, it is an instance of a simulacrum. The very idea of a robot is a simulacrum, in the sense that it is a replacement of human intelligence. Artificial intelligence is itself simulacrum. It is a replacement of human intelligence. But the anxiety is, will this gradually replace the human being? The human is the real here, and the AI, artificial intelligence, the robot, is the simulacrum here. But this is an anxiety, because ultimately a robot cannot function without human beings, right? Taking a very practical look at it. But maybe millenniums later, maybe if they are not under control, probably the robot would dominate over man. In that way, the simulacrum becomes the real, the copy becomes the real. At the basic level, if we look at it, there is this machine that you can program. You can program maps. You can create maps into it. I mean, maps of your house, and it will go and clean all those areas. You will just need to press a remote, and depending on the map, it will clear everything. So that way, it has replaced maids. We hire maids sometimes to clean the house. So that way, it has replaced maids. Okay, so it is a replacement for a maid, but after maybe years later, this entire concept of a maid will vanish. Okay, and it will be taken over by robots, these kinds of machines. So the real itself gets replaced by the simulacrum. The real, we say that it exists. I mean, this is a work that was done by someone else, but now the human element vanishes. The real vanishes there, and the copy becomes dominant. It is a postmodern, very postmodern anxiety. And yes, it is possible. And yes, it is the idea. It is fundamentally the idea of simulacrum. It is the simulacrum, artificial intelligence, because it is fundamentally a copy of human intelligence.
Right. The next question is by Prakash Chandra Patel, and his question is that notable features such as fragmentation, spatial and temporal distortion, or identity crisis, which are associated with postmodern novels, are also even seen in post-colonial novels. So can we regard these kind of post-colonial novels as postmodern fiction?
Yes, I would say, like I mentioned before, all these movements, emancipatory movements, liberatory movements, like feminism, subaltern studies, post-colonialism. All these emerged from this idea of postmodernism, where the center is dismantled, where what was considered the periphery comes to be significant, if not dominant. Okay, so these ideas obviously find mention in post-colonial fiction. So post-colonial ultimately is a liberatory movement which is against the so-called center, the West, the British, or the French, or the colonizer, the powerful. So the post-colonialism is ultimately a postmodern movement in that it attempts to replace the center. I mean, it attempts to dismantle the center. So, of course, you can see these kind of ideas appearing in post-colonial novels. And you must also consider the fact that these post-colonial novels were written at around the same time that postmodernism emerged. So maybe this kind of fragmentation, distortion, these were characteristic features of the literature of the period. So probably that influenced these post-colonial movements, and yes, it can be considered postmodern fiction.
Right. We take the last question of the day, that is by Murchana, and Murchana's question is, why and how do writers use humor in postmodernism? I mean, postmodern writing.
Humor is generally used to parody. Sometimes, not generally. Generally, postmodernism features on pastiche, which celebrates imitation, but parody, you can see parody in postmodern fiction. Then there is the instance of, I forget which text, but it is mentioned, XYZ there was a murder. Okay, there was a murder. And there's a line in the text that says, XYZ is an open and shut case. The only thing we need to find is who the murderer was. Okay, so this is an uncertainty. This is a postmodern uncertainty, and it depends on humor for its impact. It depends on humor for the creation of its effect of uncertainty. And say existentialism. Waiting for Godot, at one level, it is, I mean, if you teach it to BA students, they'll probably laugh, right? So there again, there is a use of irony, humor, and irony is again very significant. Irony is used as a means of inducing humor. Now, any kind of postmodern text is ambiguity, the ambiguity that is created. Sometimes there are texts where they begin like, you can read it on a sofa, you can read it with, you can eat it with tea. So the playfulness, the playing with words itself creates humor. Yes, but I wouldn't say humor is a very, I mean, it is a part of every kind of literature, right? Even in modernism, you can see humor. Post-colonialism, you can see humor as a way of subverting hierarchies. So postmodernism, which features on dismantling these hierarchies, obviously it will also feature humor. But right, like, you know, it is there everywhere. Humor is a feature of any kind of fiction, so to say.
Right. So with that, we come to the conclusion of this lecture, which thoroughly was very enriching and engaging, both in be it the lecture or be it the discussion. And the participants have thoroughly enjoyed it. It's always a pleasure to have Dr. Suzanne with us. And thank you, irrespective of your various obligations that you are into. You take out time for our series, and you will be back again for our coming series. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you. Young scholars like you all always give us that motivation and courage to go ahead with such kind of ventures, which has its own different and difficult kind of barriers. So thank you so much. It's always a pleasure. On behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, please do take care and see you soon. Good night.
Thank you, Dr. Saikar.